Good evening, I'm Zachary Draves, and this is Beyond the Game, the show that takes a look at the intersection of sport and social justice. Before we get into it, let us take some time to reflect on the current state of society and how sports are rapidly changing with the times. There is no question that the triple threat of COVID-19, economic insecurity, and racial injustice is putting our nation in a state of turmoil that we haven't seen in years. It has been said that sports is a microcosm of society and therefore indistinguishable from broader social issues. Oh my God. Sorry about the technical difficulties there, folks. There was a bit of an issue there with the script, and I apologize, and we will continue to venture forth with the show. So as I was saying, sport is a microcosm of society and therefore indistinguishable from broader social issues. And that can be more true than in the current moment that we're living in. And athletes at all levels are using their platforms in unprecedented ways. Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, Megan Rapinoe, Maya Moore, Kenny Stills, Malcolm Jenkins, Natasha Cloud, and countless others are continuing the traditions set forth by Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Arthur Ashe, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Billie Jean King, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Curt Flood. These are names synonymous with greatness and courage. They have made it clear that they are more than athletes. They have proven their commitment to social change despite the naysayers who want to pigeonhole athletes into a narrow box, as if athletes are only good for what they do in the arena of play. They will no longer stick to sports and certainly won't shut up and dribble, whatever that means. They are putting in their time, their resources, and their namesake toward the greater good, from advocating for voting rights to combating police brutality. Athletes are not going backwards. And you know what? Neither are we. One of those athlete activists who has solidified her place in history has been Toni Smith-Thompson. She was a basketball player at Manhattanville College in New York, who in 2003 made national headlines when she protested during the National Anthem before a game. Her act of civil disobedience made her a pariah to some, but a force for good to many. She has taken her commitment to change from the hardwood to the front lines as an organizer for the New York chapter of the ACLU, or the NYCLU, She continues to speak truth to power and makes no apologies. We are thrilled to have Toni Smith-Thompson join us this evening to discuss the current state of athlete activism and what the future holds in the broader fight for social justice. Toni, thank you and welcome to Beyond the Game.
Thanks for having me. Great intro.
Thank you for joining us, and I apologize for the inconvenience at the beginning. Had a little bit of technical difficulties.
That's our world now, right?
That's our world now, indeed, and here we are. So we'll get right into it. So really, the first question I have for you, as a way for the audience to really get to know you, tell us about yourself. Who is Toni Smith-Thompson? Where were you born, and where did you grow up?
I'm born and raised in New York City. I come from a family of educators and labor movement people, generations of activists, mostly in New York, but also some coming from Chicago, Minnesota. And I came up through public schools in New York City and went to Manhattanville College, which is in Westchester, which is a suburb of New York. So didn't go that far from New York City even to go to college. And, growing up, I was a sports kid. I got into sports. I got into basketball around 10, but I was in other sports earlier than that. And so for the most part, I was a sports kid. I spent all of my free time before school, after school, weekends. I was balling. I was always balling, and really wasn't. I hadn't really bloomed in my activism yet. As far as kind of being out and being mindful of what was happening, I was really a sports kid. So it wasn't until college that my family considered that I had come out of my activist shell. And did you good for now?
Yeah, absolutely. So you didn't come from an activist family?
No. My family, big time activists. Yeah, I come from a long line of activists, but I was always considered like I'm the youngest of all my siblings. And so, they were in their like young activist leagues, and my parents were doing their marches and labor movement stuff. So I grew up going to like UFT marches, I feel like all the time. That's the United Federation of Teachers. And anti-war marches, like all the things. But I grew up kind of like having to do all this stuff that I didn't always necessarily love doing or really understand, right? So they talked about parties a lot, and I was always like, you're always talking about a party, but there's clearly no party here, right? So there was just, you grow up in this activist environment, and I absorbed a lot of it, but wasn't necessarily then turning around and being like the high school activist that's like out getting everybody else to like wear black on a Tuesday. That wasn't until later.
And that was my next question for you. And you say that it wasn't until you went to college where you started, sort of putting two and two together. When did it click for you that things are not just in the country and in the world, and I want to do something about it? When was that moment for you?
I mean, I grew up knowing that things were not just, my grandparents were called before HUAC during the McCarthy period. And so, I come from a family where there was no illusion that the country was just, right? There was a reality that this government targets its own citizens and has a long history of doing that. But I didn't find my expression in it until college. And I majored in sociology, and so, that's a way to find your activist self, is to like just plunge straight into the prison industrial complex and like gender studies and sociology of the mind and of the this and of that. And so along with my courses, though, I was in courses with people who were already very, very active. And so we would drive up to Albany regularly to go to protests. I remember at that time, New York still had their Rockefeller drug laws on the books, which required mandatory minimums for possession of drugs, which has been an enormous part of exploding the mass incarceration in this country and the prison population. And so, so that was really when I started regularly going to protests and getting involved in more activist circles, and kind of branching off some of the time that I was spending as an athlete, also doing activist stuff. And really very little of those two worlds collided on campus for me.
Mm. And I like what you said about there's pretty much like a sociology for everything.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
kind of what the whole discipline is
yeah,
about. You can teach a sociology about music. You can
yeah.
teach a sociology about psychology. I mean, you can teach sociology of sociology, and I like what you said about how, yeah, no, I like what you said, how it really opens your mind to social consciousness and to social injustice because it allows for discussions to be had on various topics like gender studies or the prison industrial complex and so forth. And
Yeah. And I'll say those courses are really important also, because it helps you make sense of your own reality, right? Like taking those courses helped me make sense of a lot that I had been exposed to growing up that I didn't have the context for. And we didn't Google, there was no Google yet. I mean, we were in like the early years of the internet then, but it was much different to have a thought and then go look it up and be introduced to an entire world of information. You had to really be committed to wanting to know something to go try to find the answer to it or an answer to it. And so those courses for me were really critical in contextualizing my entire upbringing, the city I lived in, my family, what it means to be targeted by the government, what it means to experience racial injustice and discrimination. My dad is Black and my mom is white, and I'm the lightest of my siblings. And so there was a lot there for me in terms of understanding the experiences that I was having compared to the experiences that other members of my family were having. So they were really important in kind of opening me up to all of that.
yeah, and to that point, you say that you come from a mixed race family, your father being Black and your mother being white. Growing up, did you have any uh, tension or struggle with your racial identity in terms of how you defined yourself?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, definitely. I'm probably similar to most people who would be considered racially ambiguous, but I think for me, because I come from a family where we all look different, but I clearly am the most white passing person, or the only white passing person, really. There were I was things and my dad and my extended family were having that I wasn't having. I was very aware of them being profiled. I was very aware of them having interactions with people on the street that were definitely coded, or like, clouded by racism, that I was clear were not happening to me in the same way. And also I will say, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, growing up, that we didn't have the same lexicon. I don't feel like the conversation was not the same in for I'm trying to think of the, like, back then. I remember I would tell people I'm biracial. I'm trying to remember what I said, but I would say I'm biracial and people would say, what is that? Or I would say I'm mixed race and people would say, what is that? And so I often struggle to figure out, how can I identify myself to other people to communicate that I'm Black, but in a way that is understood or accepted. And I will clarify that when I'm saying this, I'm not talking about Black people. I'm talking about other people, right? I think, like, Black people understood. You know what I mean? I've never experienced not being accepted by Black folks, by folks in Black communities, in my family, like extended family. But outside of that, there's a lot of like trying to figure stuff out. And largely those would happen in non-Black circles. So, I think for me, the way I've identified over time has always been figuring out the best way for me to communicate that I'm Black in a way that allows me to feel understood. And now, I don't say biracial anymore. I say I'm Black and my mom is white, or like I'm Black with a white parent. Largely, I mean, for different reasons, and this is an individual choice, but I watch very carefully how identities are used to separate and divide us, and I've been really mindful and sometimes critical about how biracial has become a more acceptable, palatable Black. I've watched how Obama was the first Black president, and now he's a biracial president, right? Like you can see the evolution of language being used as a way to kind of reposition or renegotiate the caste system in this country, and I fundamentally really disagree with that. And so I don't identify that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really important for someone to be in control of their identity and be able to assert themselves unapologetically as they see themselves, and to make no apologies about that, really. So I want to go back to that day in 2003 when you made headlines for your public protests before the game, and I want you to take us through as best as you can what you remember about that day, how you were feeling, what was your mindset, and sort of like the impact that that protest has had on your life and on your career.
Yeah. Okay. When I forget part of that question, then just remind me, because I'll probably only remember half of that question. So, but my decision to, it wasn't even a decision to protest. I mean, that's not the way I thought of it. My decision was to no longer participate in that performance of patriotism that I fundamentally disagreed with. It was in the beginning of my senior year. So the season started in November, December. And so in that first semester of senior year is when, I'm deep into my core studies. It's my senior year. And I was having a conversation in which I distinguished that as co-captain of the basketball team for 3 years, I had been participating in this display of patriotism during the National Anthem. That's not something I had ever done before coming to college. I went to, I said I came from an activist family that was really aware of the limitations of justice in this country. And so in my family, we didn't participate in those traditions. And I went to schools where we didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. And, there was no deep connection to the flag or the national anthem. And so going to college really introduced me to a lot of these customs that are in sports that I didn't have to do before, including saying prayers before games. So there's a lot of kind of like social conditioning that was happening on my college team that had not happened earlier for me. And so what was I saying? So for 3 years, I had been participating in the national anthem without, I don't want to say without no thought, but kind of, this is what's required. You want to play basketball, you got to do this, especially as a freshman, you want playing time. And I wasn't even a starter freshman year. So the evolution of it is just, you come on the team, you participate in the traditions, and you're just part of the team, right? And then, I mean, I tend to think that the conversation may be different now for athletes, but then it did very much feel like you sacrificed your individual identity and for the good of the team. In order to be part of the team, there's parts of yourself that you kind of suppress, right? Or you like leave off the court. But then, that senior year, I really got to see that, especially, so set the context. I went to college in 1999. And then 9/11 happened in 2001. And so now we're in 2002. We're a year out from 9/11. We are in like the heat of post 9/11 tensions and culture and climate. And so in that context, suddenly participating in the national anthem feels very different. My school, a couple of alums did die that day. And so there were commemorative events, and their jerseys were hung up, and flags were, I think flags were added to our jerseys. I can't quite remember. I think that's right. And so suddenly this very benign seeming practice that I had been participating in was suddenly really not benign. And I got to see that even for the last 3 years, what I had been doing was not benign at all. And especially in the context of a post 9/11 America, it was really helping to cement this like obedience first kind of faux patriotism, which was really morphing very quickly into nationalism. And, and as, as a Black person, nationalism is really white nationalism in this country. And that, there's really no pretense about what that feeling is and what that mood is when American nationalism ramps up. And we are seeing that today. There's no mistaking that. So, and so I think I just made a decision. I'm not doing this. I was active in activist movements, and really kind of asking myself the hard questions about what it requires to be an activist in this country, or in general, right? But what it means to be an activist, what kind of risk it requires, what kind of resolve it requires, kind of looking back at generations before and movements before, the way people put their lives on the line and their bodies on the line, and in order to demand a future that we want to see. And this felt like one of those moments for me where I distinguished something that did not represent me, that was actively harmful, and counter to all of my beliefs and my beliefs about where we should be going as a country. And I made a decision that this is one thing that I can do, this one very tangible thing I can do to demonstrate, to resist that, and to demonstrate to myself that being an activist is really important, and it's something I'm committed to, and I had to demonstrate that for myself. And so that was, I think the first game I protested was in December, and it was really nerve-wracking. I actually hadn't really thought through. Can you hear me okay? There's some feedback. Just want to make sure. Okay. I hadn't really planned ahead of time exactly what I was going to do. I was still kind of thinking through, should I walk off the court? Should I sit? Should I stay in the locker room? And I actually decided to turn the other way during the National Anthem because I thought it would be probably the least disruptive thing to do, where I still felt good about what I was doing and felt like I could communicate to myself that I'm not going to participate in this practice. Now, clearly, I knew that people would notice, but Manhattanville is a Division III school. We don't have many fans. There's really, at that time, I couldn't fathom that anything could garner national or international attention. I couldn't even fathom my own friends coming to the game on a consistent basis. So, but it was still really nerve-wracking. There were maybe 30, 40 people in the stands. And I did have a pit in my stomach, and the National Anthem is not a really long song, but it's a really long song when you are going against the grain. And I just could not wait for it to be over. And then it was over and nothing happened. And I felt really relieved. And I did it again and I did it again, and nothing really happened for several games. And then of course, it caused, and then teammates were upset and their parents were upset. And it was brought to my attention that some of the parents of my teammates wanted to complain to the NCAA. So, and then it kind of spiraled from there and started to gain more attention as we continued in our games. We, one of the teams that we played early on in the season, their assistant coach had been deployed. And so feelings were very raw on that team with regard to the war that we were entering, that we were about to invade Iraq. And feeling very, very kind of traditionally patriotic. And so they were very unhappy with me. I got into words with one of their players after the game. We had a little thing after the game. And they, this is how the story was told to me. So hopefully this is exactly how it happened. But they called ahead and tipped off the next team we were scheduled to play. So my coach pulled me aside and was like, listen, I want to let you know, they called ahead, the next team we play, they know about your protest and it's going to be really tense. And the next team we were scheduled to play was the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And it was really intense. And they really prepared a very intimidating environment for me, but really for my entire team. They had cadets lined up all in uniform, holding flags along the sideline and holding flags in the stands. And the entire game we're just yelling slurs and yelling different really just jeering the entire time, cursing. And so, and that got picked up. One of those got picked up by the Associated Press, and the story just exploded from there.
And you mentioned that was in December of 2003. And
no, December 2002.
December 2002, excuse me.
Yeah.
And in March of 2003 is when the invasion of Iraq officially took place. Yep. And many people at the time interpreted your protest as an anti-war protest. But when we did an article over the summer, you said that it wasn't an anti-war protest. Explain what exactly the protest was about.
Yeah, so I mean, like I said before, the protest was a declaration that I'm going to resist this practice, right? Like, I'm not going to be part of blind patriotism, nationalism, especially one that has historically been used to kill my own people, and is being used internationally to kill other brown people, right? And but I think, but we were on the brink of invading Iraq, and that was the atmosphere at the time. There was really very little room to dissent, just generally speaking. However, there was a growing anti-war movement in the country. And so by, January, February, when the media was reporting that we were going to invade Iraq, at the same time that my protest story exploded, I felt like that became the natural home for my protest and a natural way for people to talk about my protest. Because when I didn't speak publicly about my protest at first, and then I finally released a written statement, and the school held a press conference where I spoke. And when I go back, if you go back and look at what I said at the time, my statements were not about the war. My statements were about oppression in this country, were about the history of genocide in this country. And my statements were about how if you are saying that this flag represents freedom and democracy, right, and all of this stuff, then you also need to recognize that it also represents massacre and genocide and slavery and segregation and ongoing police brutality, right? All of it. You need to own all of it. And if we actually have freedom of expression in this country, then I get to choose. I get to choose that this flag for me does not represent freedom, and I'm not going to participate in this ritual. So, I say, when I reflect on this now, it was much different than without social media. For your average person with the average kind of reach to get a message out, to get that message out through traditional media channels. There was really not a direct line to speak to the public in the way that you can do that today. And so there were very limited opportunities for me to actually get a message from me into the public discourse. I had my 2 statements, but then, people cover stories the way they want to cover stories, and it's very easy for stories to morph very quickly. And it takes a lot of energy to keep messaging on track. Even now, even today, it's very difficult to keep a message on a track that you want it to be on. And I didn't have the time or feel the need or really have the avenues to course correct like that. And so, I think it was okay that it was framed like that at the time. I wasn't upset about it. But it was really, but I think as people reflect on my story, and since 2016, as this conversation about athlete activism has really taken off again, it's provided an opportunity for me to correct that and to really kind of put my protest in the arc of the current movement and not outside of it.
Yeah, and the way you described your protest and what it was about, it makes me think about Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who famously protested during the anthem before every game, and he would bow his head in accordance with the Muslim faith. Because before then, he was identified as Chris Jackson. Then he was identified as Mahmoud Abdul Rauf when he converted to Islam. And when people asked him, what was his reasoning for his protests, he mirrored exactly what you were saying in some way, that the flag or the symbol of the flag and the anthem didn't include him, and he saw it and saw the anthem really as negating, America's history of slavery, genocide, police brutality, segregation, and so forth. So it was much more broader than a specific issue.
Yeah.
And also kind of like with Tommie Smith and John Carlos at the '68 Olympics, it was about racism in America. But when you look at, the current day athletes who are engaging in protests, whether it's Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the anthem, it was specifically about police brutality. So your protest, along with Tommie Smith and John Carlos, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, was part of a much broader conception. And so just wanted to kind of transition now into the present day when we're seeing athlete activism being displayed in unprecedented ways like we never had before. If anything, what has happened over this past year has regalvanized a movement that was growing, but it's only gotten stronger as we are coming to a close with 2020. And 2020 has been one hell of a year, to say the least. But what are your thoughts on the current state of athlete activism?
I love what's happening right now. I mean, it's complicated. I think you're right. I think we're seeing a protest movement among athletes that we haven't seen like this before. And, and not to minimize the long history of athletes using the sports arena to raise awareness of social and racial injustice. At the same time, right now, what we're seeing is a much more sustained, much more collective movement among athletes that is spanning professional sports, right? It's spanning the different sports, which is really powerful. And not just limited to professional sports, right? It's spanning college sports. It's spanning into grade school. When Colin Kaepernick protested first in 2016, actually there was a really large demonstration of solidarity among high school students and college students for what he was doing. And Dave Zirin, who I love to follow, is writing a book on this right now, and he's been talking about it on his social media channels recently. So it's been really great to see like what he's been getting from students who were protesting at that time. And so I think it's really important. I think athletes are harnessing their power in ways that maybe they didn't realize or had forgotten or thought that they couldn't use. And are really pushing back at the idea that they are beholden to fans and they're beholden to all of these other stakeholders, and that they don't have their own power and their own voice, and they really do. And it's been wonderful for me to see how much female athletes, the WNBA, have been leaders in this, going back years now, right? Like they have really been leaders in the space of sports and protest, in ways that I think is really important. Is a really important opportunity for us to kind of rewrite into the very public narrative about athlete protest that women, especially Black women, have not been on the sidelines. We've actually been dead center in it, but because of the ways that kind of our history gets documented and the ways we pay attention to what's happening, women are not often included in those stories. And so I think it's amazing. I'm really glad that women are front and center. I'm really glad Black women are front and center. I'm really glad that that college and high school athletes have been making space for themselves also in this, because it really is collective in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I protested. And that's something, when I look back now, had I been wiser or whatever, I sometimes wonder, like, wow, what if I had considered that my protest could have been a collective action? What if I had said to a teammate, do this with me, right? Or if I had the ability to reach across schools to another athlete and say, do this with me. So I think it's really powerful what we're seeing today.
Definitely. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the work of the WNBA and of Black female athletes in particular, who, let's not forget, it was the WNBA who engaged in public protest before Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, because you had players
Yeah.
like Nicole Moore and Tina Charles who came before the press wearing "Change Starts With Us" shirts in the aftermath of the killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling and the 5 Dallas police officers. And that was a month before Colin Kaepernick took it. So we have to really give credit where credit is due, and to acknowledge the fact that it was Black women in sports who started this new movement of athlete activism, or this regalvanized movement of athlete activism. And one of the cases that the WNBA in particular have been highlighting and making sure that people don't forget has been the case of Breonna Taylor. And they have partnered with the Say Her Name campaign, which was started by the amazing Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a professor of law at Columbia University and UCLA Law School, who coined the term intersectionality. And so they were able to form a partnership throughout their season in the bubble, and making sure that Black women who were killed in acts of state violence are not forgotten, because too often, unfortunately, Black women who are killed in state violence kind of fall by the wayside. But with Breonna Taylor, they wore Say Her Name shirts. They displayed her image on the screen. They worked with her mother. And then ultimately, the case ended up being that the police officers weren't charged with murder. And, we saw the reaction of folks who were very dismayed and very disappointed, as many of us were. What was your reaction to the outcome in the Breonna Taylor case?
I mean, I think my go-to mood these days is outraged but not surprised, and that can be hard to hold on a consistent basis. And I think that, I think many of us feel like that. This is pretty typical, right? And I think when I think about my protest in the immediate post 9/11 period, in the last how many years in the last 17, 18 years, we have really seen a centering of police as the heroes in our culture. We have seen their budgets balloon. We have seen them become more militarized, and we've seen them turn and use all of that equipment and all of those tactics on us, the American people, and specifically Black Americans, and with impunity, right? And so the protest movement right now, and what is so amazing about what the WNBA has been doing, is we are past, I hate saying it this way because I don't like to say we're past this time, because there are always people who are resisting oppression. But for a lot of time, people with big platforms, athletes included, when raising awareness of issues, it is tempting to make those issues palatable. It is tempting to say social injustice instead of police are murdering people and getting away with it, which is why Colin Kaepernick drew such ire, because that's exactly what he said, right? This is the issue. Police are committing murder and getting paid vacations. That is the issue. And Tommie Smith and John Carlos were expressing very similar sentiments, right, at the U.S., but at an international level as well, really talking about oppression across the world. I was saying it in a similar way, right? Like, we're talking about oppression here. We're talking about the ways that domestic oppression gets used internationally, and they're part of the same continuum. We're talking about police, especially now, right? Like, when I protested, really the focus was on military. But police in the United States have really become military, right? They have become military forces here. And the New York City Police Department is a domestic counterterrorism, organization, and calling that out specifically and saying this process is specifically about you and about police and about the problem with deifying police who are able to terrorize us. That is the problem. And it is really powerful and important to raise it in sports, because the police have been propped up as heroes largely through sports. and largely through paid patriotism in sports, and largely through law enforcement appreciation nights, right? And that has really contributed to the American people's inability to criticize police, hold them accountable, or and move funding away from investing in violence toward actual social services that actually create safety, right? And actually prevent widespread economic collapse, which is what we're seeing happening right now. So, not surprising, but that doesn't mean that you don't do anything about it. That doesn't mean you become apathetic to it. It's really important that we know that that the grand jury were not even given the option, right? What it looks like, they weren't even given the option to indict on more serious charges. So these are important things to know, and they're important things to keep calling out. And it's really important that the WNBA has been playing a leading role with people in communities on the grounds to do this work.
And then another thing really to keep in mind, and you mentioned the fact that the grand jury in the Breonna Taylor case were not presented with certain information. And right now we're starting to learn more about sort of like the shadiness coming from the Attorney General of Kentucky in terms of, what evidence was presented to the grand jury. And then also the ballistics report coming out that said that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend ultimately did not shoot at the officers first, contradicting what the grand jury had said. So there's a lot of confusion, and there's just a lot of murkiness that is existing within this particular case. And I like what you said about ultimately patriotism. We're living in this time now where, and really in the post 9/11 world that you articulated, which is that there's only one way to be a quote patriot in this country. But it makes me also think about the quote from James Baldwin, who said that the ultimate form of patriotism is love of country and also critiquing her perpetually, kind of paraphrasing James Baldwin there. In other words, loving your country doesn't mean that you engage in this sort of nationalistic identity where you're completely blind to certain injustices that exist within said country. And so being able to critique America when America doesn't live up to its obligations is the ultimate form of patriotism. And also look at Dr. King. Dr. King, the night before he died in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was giving the mountaintop speech, he said, America needs to stay true to what it said on paper. That's all we're asking for. We're just about out of time here, but I really appreciate what you had to say about this whole idea of patriotism, because I think that gets lost in the conversation. If anything, the truth is these athletes are engaging in the highest forms of patriotism that you can conceive of.
There's a conundrum here, which is there's this America on paper, and there's the reality, which we know that paper was never intended to include everybody. It was never intended to include Indigenous folks, Black folks. And so, it's an important strategy to continue holding America up to itself and saying, you said this. You said that this is what the ideals were, and kind of push toward that. And at the same time, knowing they didn't mean that, right? That you didn't, if it was meant to include Black people from the beginning, then you wouldn't have written it that way. You know what I mean? So yes, absolutely, resisting fascism and dissenting, those are really important forms of patriotism. And at the same time, we know, Black folks know, that when people are talking about American citizens and patriotism and all of these other kind of code words, you're talking about white America. You're not talking about Black people, right? And even, across the spectrum of white America, whether you are, really far on the right or moderate or kind of moving toward the left, the truth of the matter is, even in New York City, there's deep segregation still in neighborhoods, in schools. White people still like to be amongst each other. They still like to send their kids to schools with other white kids. Most people don't want to do the hard work of actually putting their lives and their bodies in the spaces that will help undo the legacy of segregation and racism and wealth hoarding that has happened, right? And so people would like to start from equal and just say like, okay, from this point on, we're all just gonna, I'll be good from here on out and everything will be fair. But it's not fair, right? Like, you have taken generations and generations of wealth and opportunity from Black people in this country. You have demolished our neighborhoods. You have, every time people have tried to create their own pockets of a sanctuary, because it was not offered outside of Black spaces, it was demolished, it was taken, it was redlined, it was all of these other things. And so you have generations of wealth that have been hoarded and kept from Black folks, right? And there's a real resistance to giving that back. And that's part of the work. You need to give back some of the power, you need to give back some of the money, and you need to be accountable for the oppression and the violence.
Well said, well said. So in closing here, what would you like to see happen in the sports world in terms of moving forward with the fight for racial justice? And also, how can people support you and the work that you're doing in New York with the Civil Liberties Union?
That's a great question. So I think with sports, we're already seeing it, and I hope we see more of it. But something that I'm always paying attention to in sports is how the messaging of the movement is being co-opted for profit. And because athletes are hypervisible, because they are in close proximity with owners and other people in power, it is very tempting to step back from the protest part of this movement and go into the negotiation part of the movement, which is go have a seat at the table with people in power and try to reason with them. And there's a place for that, right? But there is no substitute for power. There is no substitute for challenging power with real in-your-face protest activity. And so as we see that corporations are getting involved in protest because it's profitable, as we see Nike and ESPN do these like really polished feel-good ads about like, we're together and no one can stop us and go be your best self, we need to recognize that that is not protest. That is not the protest movement that we're talking about. That is not holding police accountable, right? You can't improve community police relations when the police are not acknowledging that they're doing anything wrong. So you need to keep calling that out. I think athletes are doing a great job, but they need to continue to evolve their tactics and messaging so that they are staying ahead of the attempts to co-opt and brands, because the test it's more palatable now. It's more palatable, right? And so at the moment in which protest becomes palatable, it is no longer as direct and as powerful.
Absolutely.
And in terms of supporting the work we're doing, I mean, I think, listen, there have been people in the streets for months during this pandemic. Right before then, we're just talking about this immediate period. People have been on the ground getting really brutalized by the police. And I think it is important for all of us, particularly people who are not directly impacted by what is happening, by the violence, by the state-sanctioned violence that is happening, to really pay attention to that, right? This is not a conversation about what protesters are doing. It's not a conversation about whether protesters are protesting the right way. We're talking about state-sanctioned violence. We're talking about violence by law enforcement. We're talking about violence at the highest levels of government. And we're talking about violence by civilians who are acting in partnership or with the tacit approval of law enforcement. That is where our focus should be. That is what we should be calling out. We should definitely be in the streets protesting, but also calling that out, holding people accountable, and still vote, because we have to do it all.
Well said. Well said. Toni Smith-Thompson, you are a venerable force for good. Your story is incredible, and everything that you are doing is miraculous. And we will continue to follow you, and we will continue to support you. Thank you so much for coming on our show. And again, apologies for the momentary hiccup at the beginning, but that can always be fixed. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Our thanks to Toni Smith-Thompson. And before we wrap up, I want to talk briefly about the importance of voting in the upcoming election. We are only 1 month away from Americans casting their ballots on November 3rd. This is your opportunity to have your say in the future of your country. It is incumbent that you get involved and to leverage your power. If you are registered and want to vote early, be sure to look up your state laws to know when early voting begins and when it ends. If you are not registered yet, there is still time. The one and only LeBron James recently started the More Than a Vote initiative that offers voter registration assistance as well as ways to combat the real problem of voter suppression. So please go to morethanavote.org, which is right at the bottom of the screen, to get registered and to get involved. Your voice and your vote matters. So let's make it happen. And also be sure to subscribe to our channel. That's Nuts and Bolts Sports. So subscribe to our channel as soon as you can, and make sure that on November 3rd you make your voice be heard. Thank you so much. I'm Zachary Draves, and on behalf of the NBS Sports team, good night.